Hello, welcome to Ancient Philosophy, this summer course that we're going to be doing online. I am Dr. Poston. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama in the philosophy department. I'm also the director of a new pre-medical institute. It's called the McCullough Institute for Pre-Medical Scholars. So I am very much excited about this course. This is the first time that I've been doing video capture of lectures. So I hope you guys enjoy this. Give me some feedback over email. Ask questions. I'll try to answer questions at the end of the lectures. And so I think you're really going to enjoy this. Ancient philosophy is one of my favorite subjects to teach. When I teach introduction to philosophy, we do a lot of Plato and Aristotle, and it introduces you to a set of philosophical issues that I think is just fascinating. These are some of the deepest questions that people wrestle with about the meaning of life, about the nature of the world, about the human good, about knowledge, about right and wrong. Just fascinating set of issues. And so I think you're really going to enjoy it. Summer is a great time to relax, to enjoy the weather, to have conversations with people. And this course, I think, will give you lots of opportunities to have long conversations with individuals. So I wanted to let you know a little bit about the dynamics of the course. The syllabus is going to be uploaded on Blackboard, so you can access that and you can learn about what we're going to do in the course. We're going to have short papers, we're going to have some quizzes, and we'll have maybe one or two exams. I also want to do some conversations over Zoom. Philosophy is meant to be talked about with other people. So, doing everything online, through email isn't ideal because philosophy is an exploration. It's really, you have some intellectual curiosity or some wonder, about a certain set of issues. And you can really learn a lot by the give and take of talking with someone. So this is something that I want to encourage you to do with your friends and your family. But we also want to do that together because we want to have fun. We want to talk to one another. So that's a little bit about the course. What I want to do in this initial lecture is just set the stage. So we want to talk a little bit about what philosophy is. And we want to do this by way of looking at some philosophers that wrote before Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. So these are known as the Presocratic philosophers. The term Presocratics actually is a relatively new term. It was coined in the 19th century. So these are individuals who represent a curious mode of investigation of the world, new mode of investigation. So they're using reason to try to figure out ultimate questions about how do we understand change and permanence? How do we understand the human person? And instead of telling myths or stories, they're interested in giving arguments and investigating. So one of the things that we need to be prepared for in this context is that when we're studying ancient philosophy, we don't have the same sort of conception of philosophy that we have nowadays with all the different specializations of knowledge. So it's not as if you have a biology department and a chemistry department and a theater and dance department and a philosophy department and a math department. These intellectual specializations were being developed in the time period that we're going to study. So the turn to philosophy, when we meet some of these individuals in a bit, is curious because it's a special way of investigating the world that's different from relying on poetry, from narrative, and from sort of mythology. So let's get started. So the software that I'm using is an open broadcasting software that is open source. So it's going to take me a while to learn how to use this. So we'll revise and improve as we go along. So let's just begin thinking about what is philosophy through the Presocratics. And as I was saying at the beginning, the Presocratics represent a distinct turn in human inquiry about the world. So these are people who are concerned, as I said, to offer arguments, to offer reasons for their views. And as I said in the previous slide, these early philosophers, in a lot of ways, are pre-scientists. So some of the questions that they're interested in aren't really going to get worked out until the 19th and the 20th century. The chemical revolution, certainly, with Joseph Priestley and others, right, begins to solve some of the puzzles about change that these early philosophers were interested in. And it's the investigation that they are a part of, right, is continuous in a lot of ways with science. In fact, it was, in the 15th and 16th century, what we would consider now scientists were called natural philosophers, right? So just, be aware of the fact that we're going to look at some claims that you might think, isn't this solved by science? Well, remember, science was developing. This was a long time ago. So the one thing that is very special about philosophy, the philosophical method in particular, is that philosophers prize an argument. So we're going to learn this skill of developing arguments, of evaluating arguments. It's a special skill, and it takes a lot of time and practice. But what an argument is it's a collection of claims. The claims are known as premises. They have a truth value. They represent the world as being a certain way. And these claims in some way are supposed to support a target claim known as the conclusion. So one of the standard arguments that you're going to see a lot if you if you take more philosophy courses is this argument that I have on the handout here. So the first premise is Socrates is a man. One of the things that we see immediately with this is this has a truth value. It makes a claim. It talks about a particular individual, Socrates, and it says that Socrates, right, is a man, right? So that's something that could be false, right? If Socrates, right, doesn't exist, or if Socrates, right, is an ancient name that picks out a female. Right? So the first claim, right, Socrates is a man. The second claim, all men are mortal. So this represents something about every male individual who's ever lived, is that they're mortal. They're subject to aging, decay, death, right? And from these two claims, we can see, right, that they support a third claim, that Socrates is mortal. So on the handout, that says moral. That should be changed, and I'll change it in the handout for you guys, right? So one special thing about this claim is, like, if we're thinking about this argument, we're thinking about, okay, Socrates is mortal. Right? Well, why think that? Well, Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal, so it follows with logical certainty that Socrates himself is mortal. Right? So what we want to do as we're investigating some of the claims that these philosophers put forward is we want to think, we'll think these claims are really interesting. Right? So what we'll see in a minute is someone is going to argue that change is impossible. Another person is going to argue, right, that permanence, right, is an illusion, right? I think, wait, hold on a minute. That's an interesting claim. It doesn't really make sense, why think it's true? And what we'll try to do is we'll try to recover some of the reasons that they have for those claims, and then we'll put those claims into an argument. So let's get started and look at some of these philosophers. Okay, so over here we have a chart of the pre-Socratic philosophers. And on the PowerPoint, which you can find in Blackboard, this will be a little clearer. But what we see, as I've said before, in the pre-Socratic philosophers is we see a distinct turn in the way they're investigating the world. So they prize observation, inquiry, discussion, and argument. So the initial group of pre-Socratic philosophers are known as the Milesians. And the first one of these is Thales of Miletus. So Thales is at the very top of your chart in that sort of orange reddish hue. Thales is known for his claim the world and everything in it is in some sense or another a form of water. So Thales says everything is water. Well, that's a really puzzling claim. How could everything be water? The rocks doesn't seem to be made of water, right? Fire is an evident part of the world. It doesn't seem to be made of water. One of the things to note about these pre-Socratic philosophers is that we don't have their writings. We have fragments, and we have other people that Plato and Aristotle and other of the ancient philosophers talk about their views. So there's a little, there's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly they're arguing or how we should understand this claim. But what we can do is take Thales as trying to argue for a universal claim. So he is thinking about the world, and he wants to understand the unity and diversity in the world. So when we look around, there are a lot of different features of the world. And in a way, we want to know, how do they relate to one another? How does one thing come about from another thing? And so what Thales is interested in, we can conjecture, is that he's interested in understanding change in terms of more fundamental features of the world. And so Thales thinks that water, right, is a good principle for understanding, right, how everything else could come about from one principle. And if we think about this a little bit, well, maybe it has something going for it, right? Water has different forms, right? It can freeze and be solid like a rock. It can be in liquid form, of course, which we're all familiar with, right? And it can exist as a gas. And so you think, yeah, all right, maybe, right? You can kind of see how you might think something like this. Still wondering, well, what about fire? How does that all work into the scenario? But Thales lived in about 7th to 6th century BCE. So that was about 2,700 years ago. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He didn't have Google after all. Now that we have Dr. Google, we're the most intelligent species in the world, right? Most intelligent individuals that have ever lived, because we have Dr. Google. So we'll cut Thales a little bit of slack. He didn't have his pocket iPhone. All right. So as you can see from the chart, even though I realize that you probably can't read it at this point, is that there are a lot of different pre-Socratic philosophers. And what we're going to do in this course is we're going to focus on the two main ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. And what we'll see is that a lot of their views are in conversation with the pre-Socratic philosophers. So I remember when I studied ancient philosophy, I took it for the first time, is the professor was talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I felt like I really needed to memorize who these people were, when they lived, some of their central claims. And to be honest, like in the study of ancient philosophy, a lot of that is just going to come as you think about the arguments from Plato and Aristotle. So I don't want to get bogged down in the details here, thinking about who were each of these individuals and what were they known for. Some of the more important pre-Socratics we're gonna look at in detail. So as the course progresses, but I'll just say right now, Pythagoras was very influential. We're going to see a lot of Pythagorean claims as we work through Plato. Parmenides is another philosopher that we'll look at in a bit as an example of someone who gives really interesting arguments for surprising conclusions. Parmenides is a pre-Socratic philosopher who has a lot of similarities with some of Plato's views. Another philosopher who's very important is Heraclitus, and we'll look at Heraclitus in a bit. And then, a final philosopher is Zeno. So some of you will have probably heard of Zeno's paradox of emotion, and we'll look at that in a bit. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at our first pre-Socratic philosopher. So we have here Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a 5th century BCE philosopher. He's best known for his claim that everything flows. In Greek, this is panthera. So some of Heraclitus's saying, so I should probably start off by saying that Heraclitus is a really puzzling thinker. So he does offer arguments, but his style is also one of sort of disruption by way of paradoxes and paradoxical sayings. So there are different ways of doing philosophy. Some people that want to stress the limits of human thought like to entertain with various paradoxes. And what we'll see as we'll go through this course is that we'll see some of these paradoxes that puzzled some thinkers like Aristotle. And we'll try to think about how to rationally resolve them. Now, some people may think they're not rationally resolvable, and the experience of realizing this as a puzzle has some cognitive significance to it. And so we'll think about that too. We'll see when we turn to the Theaetetus, right, how Plato is attempting to grapple with some of the puzzles, right, that come out of reflection from people like Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Right? So there are three representative sayings from Heraclitus from some of the fragments of his writings we have. So he says, cold things grow warm, warm things grow cold. Right? That there's a transition between incompatibles. Things that are cold can heat up to become something, right, new. Right? Cold things aren't warm, and yet somehow or another you're able to get something incompatible, right, out of cold things. How does that happen? And then once something becomes warm, it can become cold again, right? So there's this transition from something that is and has a certain characteristic to something that it's not and has a different incompatible characteristic. Wet things grow dry. Parched things grow moist. How is this possible? How is change between opposites possible? Okay. Another quote is that the barley drink disintegrates if it's not stirred. So there is, again, this notion of change into something, right, that it's not. A barley drink, most likely an alcoholic drink like beer, if it's not stirred, right, it changes into something that it's not. Right? So he's here illustrating like change is a continuous, right, feature of the world. So one of the saying that he is most well known is this idea that you can't step in the same river twice. Right? So he says, of those who step into the same rivers, different and different waters flow. Right? So you can never, right, go to the same river and step in the same, right, water. This is sort of an interesting idea. It's this idea that there's a sameness. There's the river, but the river in some way is made up of things, right? It's made up of, composed, constituted by, right, water, and the waters are never the same, right? So one way to take what Heraclitus is doing here is he's thinking, he's trying to suggest and argue that permanence is an illusion. That when you try to think of something that's stable and unchanging, right, you can't, because it's an illusion. There is no permanence. Right? So how could we put this in terms of an argument? So the claim that we want to support is that everything constantly changes, or that nothing is permanent. Relatedly, permanence is an illusion. Right? So let's start with the first premise. The first premise, like the first idea, right, is that when we think of things in the world, right, we, by observation and study, see that they're made up of, right, other items that we can identify. So rivers, right, are made up of waters. Fields, are made up by earth. Persons are made up of flesh and blood. Right, so think of things, right, in the world, and you can say they have smaller parts that in some sense or another compose, right, that thing. So that seems a pretty reasonable view, right, to have, right? The computer that I'm, using right now is made up of computer parts, right? And those parts themselves are made up of things, right? Um, and so on. You can come up with your own examples, right? And then we think about those identifiable things, right? Those things are constantly changing, right? So the waters, right, that compose our lakes and streams and rivers and oceans are constantly changing. The soil, right, that makes up fields, are constantly undergoing processes, chemical processes that are changing. And similarly with persons, right? The individual cells, right, that compose the human body are constantly changing, right? So in some sense or another, right, in 5 years or 10 years, I don't know exactly how many years, you will completely, replace all the cells in the body. We can think even, with contemporary science, we think of things that are solid, permanent, right, like tables. And when we think about them, they're composed of atoms. And we think, well, what's going on with those atoms? And they're constantly undergoing change. Right? So Heraclitus here is presenting, right, an observation, and an argument for a really interesting claim that nothing is permanent. Everything constantly changes. And what we're going to see is this has some significant upshots that we'll study when we get to Plato, and then Aristotle also will want to reply to this. All right, so let's look at another pre-Socratic philosopher. So here we have Parmenides. Parmenides, as I said before, we'll just put this up here. Parmenides, as I said before, is one of the main influences on Plato. Very similar, like Plato will adopt some of the same views that Parmenides has. So we saw with Heraclitus is arguing that permanence is an illusion, that everything changes. Parmenides, by contrast, wants to argue that everything is one and that change is an illusion, right? So this is one of the things that I think is a lot of fun about philosophers, and a lot of fun about philosophy is that philosophers think about really interesting claims, right? And then oftentimes you'll find an argument for one claim, and you think, oh, that's a reasonable argument. I really like that argument. And then you'll find that there's another philosopher who is arguing for the exact opposite of that claim. And then you look at that claim and you'll be like, wow, he's got a good argument for that. And then who's right? And there's this sense of wonder in the exploration, right, of philosophical claims, and you learn a lot by trying to untangle, the issues that are involved in trying to come to a reasoned view over, some of these really interesting questions. Okay, so Parmenides. So Parmenides wants to argue that change is an illusion. Right? Change is, and he's going to argue this by arguing that change is impossible. So you might think, well, hold on a minute. Didn't Heraclitus just convince us that everything was change? And we went through that reasoning, it was all right, maybe persuasive, right? And now we're going to face a philosopher that thinks, no, exact opposite, change is impossible. So let's think about this argument. So start with a claim that change requires something to come from nothing. Right? So what does that mean? Well, the way Parmenides is thinking about change here is he's not thinking only of movement, right? But he's thinking of the way individuals can grow and decay and change their properties over time. So think of a person who's born, right, when they're young, right? We might say they're short, definitely not, a young child, definitely not tall. But yet a tall person can come from a short person. So you have something that this person wasn't tall, and then yet they become something they weren't. So how is that possible? How can something, right, come about from nothing, right? Or fire comes about from something that's cold, right? That's not on fire. Old, aging, right, comes about from youth. Again, right, how is that possible? How is it possible for uh, one thing to come from something that's not? A puzzle that we'll see later in Plato's Zeno is a question about knowledge. How can knowledge come from something that isn't knowledge? Right? Knowledge has a special character to it, and if you don't know something, how can you come to know something? Because in order to know something, you'd have to be able to have some other knowledge, right? Knowledge that would enable you to identify, right, the thing that you wanted to know. But how is that possible? If you know, right, the thing that you want to know so that you can identify it, then you already know it. So if you don't know it, then how can you come to know it, right? This is very much kind of a puzzle, right, that Parmenides investigates. Like, how is it literally possible for one thing that has a certain property that lacks this other property to then develop that property? Okay. So the next claim is one that a lot of people have very strong philosophical intuition, is that it's just impossible for something to come from nothing. And here, when we say this, we mean like something that's literally nothing. Sometimes you'll say, you'll read, a physicist will say, oh, well, contemporary physics has shown, right, how something can come from nothing. And what they mean is that if you have a physical field that has certain properties, right, then there can be a fluctuation that results in another property. Well, that's not something coming from literally nothing. That's something coming from a field that has certain properties, right? So Parmenides and others, when they think about this, right, you have to think there's literally nothing. Now that's a hard thought to think. Think of literally nothing. What is that like, right? The absence of time, of space, of matter, right, of extension. And then from that thought, right, that there's nothing, right, you're supposed to imagine something that comes about. That's very puzzling. Okay, so we'll let that go. I hope that you're puzzled about that. So then, if those two claims are right, then it follows that change is impossible, right? If change literally requires something to come from nothing, and it's impossible for something to come from nothing, then change is impossible. So that's Parmenides' argument, that change is an illusion. We're gonna, Aristotle has, I think, the most sophisticated response to this, which we'll study in a couple weeks. All right, so let's look at our last pre-Socratic philosopher. So here we have Zeno of Elea. Zeno is famous for the paradoxes of motion, for Achilles and the tortoise, and so on. And so what we're going to look at is Zeno's paradox, right? That movement is impossible. So movement is a kind of change. We just looked at Parmenides' argument that change is impossible. Parmenides' argument is a more general argument. Zeno's argument is focused just on motion. And again, what we see here is we see the virtues of philosophical approach. If you start off with a claim that's interesting, motion's impossible, and right, you offer a reasoned defense of it, such that the claims, the premises that you use to defend the conclusion, right, aren't patently absurd. They're plausible, and they support this other claim that you think is implausible. So let's look at this. We have the first claim that, if you start, say, at point A, and you want to go to point B, then that's going to require traversing an infinite. And you might think, okay, what is that going on? If I'm going from, Lloyd Hall, and I'm going to walk across the quad, and I'm going to go over to the philosophy department to 10th floor, right? That's not an infinite distance. Well, Zeno thinks, well, hold on, it still requires traversing an infinite, because if you look at the image on the right of your screen, right, you'll see to go from the start to the end, see the person sort of bounding across those semicircles, you have to go half of the way. Okay? And then, right, to go the rest of the half, you'd first have to go half of that, so you'd have to go a fourth of the way. And then you'd have to go half of that, so you'd have to go an eighth of the total distance. And then a 16th and 32nd and a 64th and so on and so on and so on. Right, so that at each stage, when you complete that journey, you'll have just a little bit left to go. You won't quite get to where you want to go. Okay? So Zeno says if we think about this rationally, we can see that it's actually impossible to complete an infinite series, right? Because you'd have to go half, and then you'd have to go half of half, and half of half, and half of half, and half of half, and you never actually get to where you're going. And so Zeno, along with Parmenides, is thinking, all right, well, then, motion is itself an illusion. This evident, right, feature of sense experience that we see things move, right, is in some way a cognitive illusion, that true reality is reality that's grasped by the mind, right, that's grasped by principles, by the intellect, and that's discovered by philosophers. So that's a little bit about the Presocratics. Each of these arguments are influential in Plato and Aristotle. They're concerned to think about these arguments, to sort of evaluate their perspective on the argument, and fun things to talk about. So I hope that you're looking forward to reading and thinking more about ancient philosophy. I'm certainly looking forward to meeting you. And we will start off on Wednesday. We're going to read the Euthyphro. So the Euthyphro is a discussion that Socrates has with a priest who has convicted his father of a crime. And Socrates is puzzled that this priest would convict his own father, that the priest must have some sort of ethical knowledge that resides in him that gives him such a certainty to convict his very own father. And so it then begins a conversation over ethical principles with Socrates. And so we're going to learn some fascinating things in this discussion of the Euthyphro. So I hope you look forward to that. I look forward to seeing you. Again, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email and read the syllabus, and hope to see you on Zoom soon. All right, y'all take care.